The auctioneer's gavel hung suspended in the air, trembling as if even the wooden mallet sensed the dangerous electricity crackling through the afternoon heat. Nellie Turner stood on the rough-hewn wooden block in the center of Caldwell, Kansas, the June sun of 1882 beating down on her bare head, her dark hair pinned back unevenly because her hands had been shaking too hard that morning to fix it properly. Her dress was clean but worn at the elbows. Her eyes were dry because she had promised herself she would not cry, not here, not in front of these men who were looking at her like she was a parcel of land, like she was a head of cattle, like she was something that could be owned and transferred and signed over with a bill of sale. The auctioneer, a man named Corbett Finch with a red face and a waxed mustache, was clearing his throat and opening his mouth to announce the final price when the crowd parted. Not slowly, not politely. The crowd parted the way water parts around a stone throne with great force, stumbling and scattering to either side, hats knocked from heads, men stepping back instinctively because the man walking through them moved with a kind of contained fury that made sensible people get out of the way without being asked. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that was not performance but function, the kind of build that came from years of physical labor rather than any vanity. His jaw was set so hard it looked carved. His dark eyes were fixed not on Corbett Finch but on the block where Nellie stood, and there was something in that gaze that made her breath catch in her chest, not from fear exactly, though fear was part of it. Something else. Recognition, maybe. As if someone had finally looked at her and seen the full scope of the wrong being done. He stopped at the base of the block. Corbett Finch sputtered. "Now see here. I have the legal right to conduct this auction under the terms of the debt collection notice filed in Comanche County, and this is a lawfully arranged." "Step down from that block," the man said, and his voice was low enough that Nellie was not sure everyone in the crowd heard it, but Corbett Finch certainly did, "because this sale is already over." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Nellie stared down at him from the block. He was looking up at her now, and up close she could see that beneath the controlled fury there was something else in his expression, something careful, something that looked almost like an apology. "Ma'am," he said quietly, holding out one hand, "step down." And Nellie Turner, who had not asked anyone for help in the 3 years since her father had died and left her with nothing but debt and a crumbling homestead, looked at that offered hand and felt something crack open inside her chest that she could not immediately name. She took it. What happened after that would take days to fully understand, and weeks to fully reckon with, and perhaps the better part of a lifetime to resolve into something she would call love. But it began there, in that terrible moment on the auction block, with a man she had never spoken to handing her down from the lowest point of her life as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His name was Lionel Graves, and Nellie Turner did not know yet what he had sacrificed to arrive at that moment in time. To understand it, you had to go back to the beginning of the summer, back to when the debt notice arrived. Nellie had been out behind the small clapboard house she and her father had built together when she was 12 years old, the house that sat on 80 acres of good grassland in Comanche County, Kansas, when the county clerk's rider had come up the road. She had been mending the fence along the south pasture because 3 of the 4 fence posts had rotted through and her horse, Clover, kept wandering out, and she kept having to go bring Clover back, and frankly, she did not have time for any of it. She saw the rider and she felt dread like cold water in her stomach before she knew why. The notice was formal and dense with legal language, but the substance of it was simple and brutal. Her father, Thomas Turner, had taken a loan of $400 from the Caldwell Commercial Bank in 1879 to purchase seed and fencing supplies during the drought year. He had made partial payments until his death from a lung fever in the winter of 1880. The bank had extended the debt for 1 year as a courtesy to his estate. That year had passed, and then another half year had passed, and now the balance with interest and penalties stood at $462. If Nellie could not produce the money within 60 days, The bank had the legal authority to attach the property and hold a public auction of any assets, including personal service contracts, to satisfy the debt. Personal service contracts. She had sat down in the grass right there by the rotting fence post and read that phrase 3 times. It was, she knew, a legal mechanism that had become increasingly controversial in the Western territories. A person unable to pay a debt could agree to a period of contracted labor to satisfy it, and the right to that labor contract could be sold at public auction. It was not slavery, the law was very careful to note. It was not slavery. It was a voluntary labor agreement. It lasted only as long as required to work off the debt at a predetermined daily rate. What it felt like was a different question entirely. Nellie was 24 years old. She had no family left in Kansas. She had no savings. She had the house, the 80 acres, the horse clover, 6 chickens, and 2 pigs, none of which combined would satisfy a debt of $462. She had the crops she had planted in the spring, which were coming in well, but harvest was 3 months off and the debt was due in 60 days. She had spent those 60 days doing everything she could think of. She had written to her mother's sister in Missouri, who had 3 children of her own and a husband who worked the railroads and could not help. She had approached the 2 neighboring ranches about the possibility of selling off a portion of the 80 acres, but the going rate for Kansas grassland that year was poor, and even the full acreage would not have brought $400. She had worked extra days at the Caldwell dry goods store, earning 25 cents a day, and she had saved every cent, and by the end of 60 days she had managed to put together $37 and some change. She had gone to the bank and presented it to the bank manager, a man named Harold Pease, who was not unkind, but who was also not the one who made the rules. He had looked at the $37 with genuine regret and told her that the bank's board had instructed him to proceed with the auction unless the full balance was paid. Nellie had walked out of the bank into the blazing Kansas sun and stood on the boardwalk for a long moment, watching the dust move down the main street of Caldwell, and she had made herself breathe slowly, and she had told herself that whatever happened next, she would face it standing upright. The morning of the auction she had dressed carefully. She had worn her best dress, the one she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a catalog 2 years before, a deep blue cotton that she had taken in at the waist to fit her properly. She had put up her hair. She had walked the 2 miles into town because she had not wanted Clover to have to stand in the heat. She had been entirely alone on that walk, and that was the part she did not let herself think about for very long, because loneliness was the kind of thing that could unravel you if you let it, and she did not have the luxury of being unraveled. Not yet. Lionel Graves had come to Caldwell, Kansas 6 months earlier from a ranch in southern Colorado that he had been working for 5 years. He was 31 years old, and he was not, by any traditional measure of the word, a gentle man. He was not rough or cruel, but he was direct in a way that made some people uncomfortable, and he had a temper that he kept on a very short leash, but that everyone around him knew was there. He had learned to manage it early, because the alternative had cost him things he could not afford to lose. He had come to Caldwell because a man named Dutch Holloway had offered him a foreman position at the Broken H Ranch, which was 12 miles east of town and ran 500 head of longhorn cattle. The pay was fair, and the work was honest, and Lionel had been ready to stop moving. He had been moving for most of his adult life, following work across Texas and Oklahoma and Colorado, and something in him had worn down to the point where the idea of staying somewhere for more than a season had started to feel not like a trap, but like a relief. Dutch Holloway's ranch was a good operation. Lionel had settled in quickly, proven himself as a foreman within the first 2 months, and started to feel, for the first time in years, like he might actually build something. He had begun quietly inquiring about land prices in the county, not urgently, not with any set plan, just the way a man might begin turning over an idea in his mind when he started to believe the future might actually exist for him. He had first seen Nellie Turner in late April, at the dry goods store on the main street of Caldwell. He had been in town to pick up supplies, and she had been behind the counter helping Mrs. Amos, the owner's wife, sort through a shipment of fabric bolts. She had been focused entirely on the work, making notes in a small ledger, and she had not looked up when he came in, and he had stood at the counter for a moment before clearing his throat. She had looked up then, and he had noticed her eyes first. They were a dark amber, an unusual color, the kind of color that seemed lit from inside in certain kinds of light. There was a sharpness in them that went along with the firm set of her mouth, the way she held herself, economical and contained. "Can I help you?" she had said, and her voice was low and clear and had no particular warmth in it, which he had appreciated. He had had enough of people performing warmth they did not feel. He had given her the supply list, and she had filled it efficiently, and they had conducted the entire transaction without a single superfluous word. And when he had walked out of the store, he had found himself wondering who she was in a way that he had not wondered about anyone in a long time. He had asked Dutch about her later that evening, casually, the way you might ask about the weather. Dutch had told him about Thomas Turner, the homesteader who had died 2 winters back, and the daughter who had stayed on to work the land alone, and the debt with the bank. Dutch had said it with the particular tone men used when they were describing a situation they felt was unfortunate, but not their problem. Dutch was not a bad man, but he was a practical one. Lionel had not thought much more about it. Or rather, he had thought about it in the background of his days, the way you think about something that bothers you without having a clear reason why. He had seen Nellie 3 more times over the following weeks, twice in town, and once when he had ridden past her farm on his way out to the far eastern pasture to check on a stretch of fence. She had been out in her field, working a hand plow along a row, and she had not seen him, and he had not stopped because there had been no reason to stop. But he had slowed down. He had been in Caldwell on an errand for Dutch when he had seen the notice posted on the board outside the general store: public auction, debt satisfaction, Turner property and associated assets. He had read the date and his jaw had tightened. He had gone back to the ranch and thought about it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he had done something that surprised even himself. He had gone to his room in the bunkhouse, and he had opened the tin box he kept under the loose floorboard, and he had taken out the money inside. He had been saving it for land, a little over $500 that he had accumulated over 5 years of careful living and honest wages, and 1 lucky hand of poker that he still thought about with a kind of guilty pleasure. $523, the entirety of what he had to show for the last several years of his life. He had sat with it in his hands for a long time. Then he had put it in his jacket pocket and ridden into town to speak with Harold Pease at the Caldwell Commercial Bank. The conversation with Harold Pease had not gone the way Lionel expected. The bank manager had been surprised to see him, and more surprised by the money on the desk. He had looked at it with something that was not quite discomfort but was close to it. "Mr. Graves," he had said carefully, "I appreciate the gesture, and I am aware you are employed at the Broken H, so I understand this is a substantial sum for you to be offering, but I have to be honest with you. The terms of the auction are already in motion. The board has approved the process. To halt it now would require a formal settlement agreement with the debt holder, which means the full sum of $462 paid directly to the bank, with a signed release of the lien against the Turner property." Lionel had put $462 on the desk. He had kept the remaining $61 in his pocket. Harold Pease had stared at the money. Then he had looked up at Lionel with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. "Mr. Graves, I have to ask, what is your relationship to the debt holder?" "There is no formal relationship," Lionel had said. "Then I am afraid I cannot accept a third-party payment without the consent of the debt holder herself. The arrangement requires her signature on the settlement agreement. If she does not consent, the bank cannot legally proceed. Lionel had stared at him. You are telling me that even if the money is right here on the table, you cannot stop the auction without her permission? That is correct. The debt is hers. The settlement must be hers. She has to agree to accept the payment and sign the release. This was the part that had changed everything, because it had forced Lionel to do something he had been very deliberately avoiding. He would have to speak to Nellie Turner directly, which meant explaining what he was doing and why, and he did not have a clean explanation. He had a feeling and a sense of justice and a quantity of money, and none of those things were the kind of thing a sensible man walked up to a stranger and said. He had ridden out to her farm that evening. She had been on the porch when he arrived, mending something by the last of the daylight, and she had looked up when she heard Clover's hoofbeats, and then frowned when she realized it was not her own horse returning. He had dismounted and stood at the base of the porch steps and introduced himself, and she had watched him with those amber eyes that gave nothing away. "I know who you are," she had said. "You work for Dutch Holloway." "I do." "What do you want?" he had told her. Directly, without preamble, because she did not strike him as a woman who would appreciate being softened up. He had told her he had the money to settle the debt. He had told her it required her consent and her signature. He had told her there were no conditions attached. The silence after he finished speaking was one of the more uncomfortable silences he could remember sitting through, and he had sat through some significant silences in his life. "No conditions," she said, and her voice was very careful. "No conditions. You are asking me to believe that a man I have met once in a dry goods store wants to pay off my father's debt out of the goodness of his heart." "Not exactly," he had said, and then had stopped, because the honest answer was complicated and he was not sure she would receive it well. "I think what is happening to you is wrong. The law may say otherwise. I do not particularly care what the law says. It is wrong." She had studied him for a long time. The evening light was going orange and copper behind the tree line, and the chickens were settling in for the night, and somewhere out in the pasture Clover whinnied softly. "I cannot accept your money, Mr. Graves," she had said finally. He had felt something drop in his chest. "May I ask why?" "Because I do not know you, because I do not take charity." Because she had stopped and pressed her lips together, and there was something in her face that was raw and tired and proud all at once. "Because I have been taking care of myself for 3 years, and if I start accepting money from strangers I will not be able to stop needing it, and that is a road I cannot afford to go down." He had wanted to argue. He had felt the argument forming in his chest, the perfectly reasonable points about practicality and the very specific and limited nature of the offer. He had made himself be quiet instead. "All right," he had said. He had ridden back to the ranch with $462 in his pocket. He had not slept well that night. In the morning he had made a decision that was either the most rational thing he had ever done or the most foolish, and even years later he was not entirely sure which it was. He had gone back to the bank and told Harold Pease that he wanted to be present at the auction, and he had kept his money. The morning of the auction he had ridden into Caldwell earlier than necessary and tied his horse at the far end of the main street and watched the crowd gather. He had watched Corbett Finch set up the auction block, a rough platform of stacked lumber that someone had brought out from the back of the hardware store. He had watched men cluster in groups of 2 and 3, talking in low voices, some of them there for the spectacle and some of them, he understood, with a deep, steady anger, there to bid. He had watched Nellie Turner walk into town from the road, alone, carrying herself with a straight back and her chin level, and her face set into an expression that he recognized as the human equivalent of armor. He had watched her climb the steps to the platform and stand there, and the moment she was up there something happened to his vision, some narrowing of focus, as if the rest of the world had become less real. Corbett Finch had begun his patter, describing the terms of the labor contract, the daily rate at which the debt would be worked off, the duration, and Lionel had felt his jaw tighten with every word. And then Corbett had called for opening bids, and 2 men had raised their hands, and a third had called out a number, and Lionel had already been moving. He had not planned what he said. Later he would think about it and realize that nothing could have been more calculated to stop everything cold than what he had said, not because it was dramatic, but because of how absolutely certain he had sounded. Not threatening, not loud, certain. Step down from that block because this sale is already over. And it was. He had settled the debt with Harold Pease right there at the auction, producing the money in full, and Corbett Finch had been presented with the bank's written confirmation that the lien was satisfied, which meant there was no legal basis for the auction to proceed, which meant the auction was, in point of fact, over. Nellie had stood beside Lionel during this process with her arms folded and her face very still, watching the legal proceedings with an expression that gave him no clear read on what she was thinking. When it was done and Corbett Finch had folded up his papers and the crowd had dispersed in the way that crowds do when the entertainment is canceled, she had turned to him and said quietly, "You went ahead and did it anyway." "Yes. After I told you not to. You told me you could not accept it directly. You did not say I could not pay the bank directly. I paid the bank directly. The debt is satisfied. You owe the bank nothing." She stared at him. He could not tell if she was about to thank him or order him off her property, and he was aware that even though they were standing in the middle of Main Street in Caldwell rather than on her actual property, the question applied in spirit. "I owe you $462, she said. "No, Mr. Graves, no," he said again, and he meant it with every part of himself. "This is not a loan. I am not expecting repayment." "Then what are you expecting?" It was the most direct question anyone had asked him in years, and it landed in the center of his chest and made him want to look away, which he did not allow himself to do. "Nothing," he said. And then, because that was not entirely true, "I would like to know that you are all right." Nellie looked at him for a long time. The afternoon had gone past its hottest point, and the dust in the street was settling, and somewhere down the block a door banged open and shut. "I am not all right," she said at last, and her voice was completely level. "I am not all right at all. I was just standing on an auction block in front of half the county. I walked 2 miles here this morning by myself because I did not know what else to do. I am very far from all right." He had not known what to say to that. He had not expected that level of honesty, not when her whole bearing had been so carefully controlled. "But I am standing," she added, and there was something in that that sounded like the end of a very long argument she had been having with herself. "Yes," he said, "you are." She looked at him again with those amber eyes, and he felt the look like a physical thing, like a hand pressing flat against his sternum. "Come and have supper," she said. "It is the least I can do. It is not $462, but it is supper." He had followed her out of town and down the road to the small clapboard farmhouse, and she had cooked a meal from what she had, which was not much but which she prepared with a focused competence that he found himself watching with more attention than the situation strictly required. Cornbread and beans and salt pork, a jar of pickled tomatoes that she had put up herself from last year's garden, a pot of strong coffee. They had eaten at the small kitchen table, and the conversation had been careful at first, measured, 2 people feeling out the territory between them. He had told her about the broken H, about his work, about where he had come from. She had told him about the farm, about her father, about the years she had been managing alone. "Were you not afraid?" he asked her at one point. "Living out here alone?" She had considered the question seriously, which he liked. She did not brush it off. "I was afraid all the time at first," she said. "I was 21 when my father died, and I had no idea what I was doing with the crops or the animals or the accounts. I made a lot of mistakes that first year." She paused, but fear is a very loud visitor. If you make room for it and give it a chair and let it will shout all day and you will never get anything done. So I learned to hear it and then set it aside and do the next thing anyway. "And today?" he asked. She looked down at her coffee cup. Today fear had a very large chair. He wanted very much to say something that would matter. He settled for the truth. You were the most composed person on that block." "I was composed on the outside," she said. "The inside was a different situation entirely." He smiled at that, and she looked up and caught the smile, and something shifted between them, small but real, like a door opening just a crack. She did not smile back right away, but the corners of her mouth moved, and after a moment it broke through, brief and a little reluctant, and it changed her whole face. He rode back to the Broken H in the dark, and Dutch Holloway was still up on the porch with a pipe, and he looked at Lionel with the expression of a man who had been waiting for someone to explain himself. "I heard you paid off the Turner girl's debt," Dutch said. "The bank's debt," Lionel said. "The lien was against the property. I paid the bank." Dutch took a slow draw on his pipe. "That is a considerable amount of money, Lionel." "It is. You want to tell me what you are thinking?" "I am thinking," Lionel said, stopping with one boot on the porch step, "that what was happening to her was wrong, and I was the only person in the county who had the means to stop it." Dutch studied him for a moment. "And the personal dimension. I had supper with her this evening." Dutch took another slow draw. "Well," he said, "I suppose that is a start." Over the following weeks, Lionel found reasons to pass by the Turner farm. He did not manufacture them exactly, but he was also honest enough with himself to acknowledge that the routes he chose for his work were not always the most direct ones. He repaired the fence along her south pasture the second time he stopped, because the rotten posts were an obvious problem, and he had the materials in the wagon, and it would have been absurd not to fix them. She had argued about it for a full 5 minutes before allowing it, and he had worked through her protests by beginning immediately and asking her to hand him tools, which had the effect of making her a participant in the project rather than simply a recipient of help, and he had understood from the way she settled into it that this was the correct approach with her. She began to let him stop when he passed. Not always. Some days she would wave from the field and he would wave back and keep riding, because he understood instinctively that she needed to know she could set the terms, that his presence was not inevitable or overwhelming. But some days she would set down whatever she was doing and walk to the fence, and they would talk, and those conversations were the best part of his days in a way that he found both thrilling and slightly alarming. She was funny, which he had not expected. Not light or frivolous, but sharp, with a dry angle on things that caught him off guard regularly. She had opinions about everything: the state of the railroad expansion, the price of wheat, the way the county government managed public works, the novels she read by lamplight in the evenings, though books were hard to come by, and she traded them back and forth with Mrs. Amos at the dry goods store. She was reading a novel called Ben-Hur, which had been published 2 years before, and she had strong feelings about it. "You should read it," she told him one afternoon, leaning on the fence while he mended the section nearest the road. "I am not much of a reader," he said. "That is not a fixed condition," she said. "You can become one." He had laughed at that, and she had looked a little surprised by the sound of it, as if she had not quite expected it, and then she had laughed too, and he had thought, "There it is. That is the sound I want to hear every day for the rest of my life." It was a terrifying thought, and he put it away and kept mending the fence. In July, 3 weeks after the auction, the trouble came in a different shape. A man named Edgar Collies arrived in Caldwell. Collies was a land broker out of Wichita, and he had a legal document claiming that Thomas Turner had made a separate private agreement with a Wichita land investment company in 1878, 4 years before his death, granting them first right of refusal on the purchase of the 80 acres in the event that the property changed hands or was subject to any legal action involving debt. Nellie found out about this when a letter arrived at the farm, delivered by the same county clerk's writer who had brought the original debt notice. She brought it to Lionel's attention the next morning when he came by, holding it out to him without preamble. He read it twice, carefully. "This says your father signed this agreement in 1878, he said. "That is what it claims." "You had no knowledge of it?" "None. My father never mentioned any arrangement with a Wichita investment company. He was not the kind of man to hide things from me." She paused. He also was not always the best judge of who he was doing business with. Lionel studied the document. The language was complex in the way that legal language became complex when it was trying to obscure rather than clarify. This is claiming that because the property was subject to legal action involving debt, the right of refusal has been triggered. Yes, but the debt has been settled. The lien has been released. Collies appears to be arguing that the triggering event was the initial filing of the auction notice, not the actual auction itself, and that the settlement does not retroactively negate the trigger. Lionel looked up at her. That is a remarkable legal theory. It is a remarkable legal theory designed to steal my farm, she said, and her voice was even but her eyes were burning. He folded the letter carefully. We need to speak with a lawyer. I cannot afford a lawyer. I can. She started to object and he raised one hand, not stopping her, just pausing her. Nellie, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name and he felt her notice it, saw the small shift in her expression. I am not asking permission. I am telling you that I will speak with a lawyer in Wichita on this matter, and then I will tell you what the lawyer says. After that, you can make whatever decisions you choose. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, I am going to repay you for all of this. I am aware that it will take years. I am keeping a very careful record. Keep whatever record makes you feel better, he said. But do not let it stop you from accepting help when help is the sensible thing. He rode to Wichita 2 days later and spent a day and a half with a lawyer named Alastair Drummond, who had a practice on the main street and who had, according to Dutch Holloway's recommendation, successfully argued 3 property disputes in the past 5 years. Drummond examined the document with great attention and then leaned back in his chair and said, the triggering clause is highly ambiguous. A skilled argument could be made either way. What I can tell you is that the right of refusal agreement, if it is genuine, does not transfer ownership. It only grants the holder the right to purchase at market value, meaning even if their claim holds legally, they cannot simply take the property. They can only purchase it at market value, which would need to be assessed. And if they are attempting to claim ownership outright, Lionel said, then they are operating outside the law, Drummond said simply. Lionel hired him on the spot. He brought the information back to Nellie and watched her process it, standing in her kitchen with her hands flat on the table and her head down. And he recognized the posture as someone absorbing information that was bad but manageable, sorting through the implications. So they cannot take it from me, she said. Not directly, not legally, but they could try to buy it at a valuation that is unfair. Drummond will contest any unfair valuation. She straightened up and looked at him across the table, and he thought for the 100th time that she was the most capable person he had met in years, and also one of the most alone, and both of those things pulled at him in ways he was not entirely sure how to manage. Lionel, she said, using his first name deliberately, he could tell, meeting the intimacy he had introduced with the same. Why are you doing this? He could have said many things. He could have talked about justice or fairness or the abstract wrongness of Edgar Collins' scheme. All of those things were true, he said, because it matters to me that you are all right, specifically you, not in a general sense. She held his gaze for a long time. That is a very honest answer. It seemed like the kind of question that deserved one. She looked down at her hands on the table. I do not know what to do with that, she said quietly. With someone caring specifically about me. It has been a long time. You do not have to do anything with it, he said. I am not offering it as a debt. I am offering it as a fact. She looked up at him, and in the kitchen light her eyes were very warm and very careful all at once. You are a very strange man, Lionel Graves. I have been told, he said. Edgar Collins arrived at the Turner farm one evening in late July with 2 men from his company and a surveyor and a general manner that suggested he expected very little resistance. He knocked on the door, and when Nellie opened it, he introduced himself with a professional pleasantness that did not quite reach his eyes, and explained that he was there to conduct a preliminary property assessment. Nellie told him that she had retained legal counsel who would be handling all communications regarding the right of refusal claim, and she handed him Alastair Drummond's card. Collies's pleasant manner developed a crack in it. Miss Turner, she said. Miss Turner, I think you may not fully understand the nature of the legal agreement your father entered into. I understand it entirely, she said. My attorney has reviewed it. Correspondence should be directed to him. Good evening, Mr. Collies. She closed the door. Lionel, who had been sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and who Collies had not been able to see through the door, waited a beat and then said, "That was impressive." She turned around and he could see that her hands were shaking slightly and that she was holding herself very tight. He stood up and crossed the kitchen, and without entirely planning it, he put one hand over both of hers, covering the trembling, and she looked up at him, and the armor was off briefly, and he could see how tired she was, how deeply tired, and he wanted to do something about that in a way that went well beyond legal assistance or fence repairs. "You are not alone in this," he said. She did not say anything, but she turned her hands over and held his, just for a moment, and then she stepped back and took a breath and said, "I will make more coffee," which was her version of returning to solid ground, and he let her have it. Alastair Drummond's legal argument, filed with the county court in August, was methodical and effective. He demonstrated that the right of refusal clause was triggered only upon a completed property transfer, not upon the initiation of debt proceedings. He further argued that even granting the most favorable possible interpretation of the triggering clause, the debt had been satisfied before any auction was completed, and therefore no qualifying event had occurred. He also raised significant questions about the authenticity of the 1878 document, requesting the original for examination. Edgar Collies countered with his own legal filing, and for 6 weeks in July and August Nellie's farm was the subject of a quiet legal battle that she watched with steady nerves and Lionel watched with a barely contained fury that he expressed by making himself useful wherever he could, which over those weeks meant repairing her barn roof, helping her get her crop in when harvest came, and spending more evenings at the kitchen table than could be explained by practical necessity. He told himself that he was making sure she was all right. He was also sitting across from her in the lamplight watching her read and listening to her laugh, and learning the exact particular way she took her coffee, and the sound she made when she was thinking hard, a quiet exhalation through her nose, and the way she tucked her feet under her when she sat in the armchair in the evenings. And he was building an interior picture of her that was becoming the most detailed and important thing in his life. And he knew it, and he was not sure what to do about it. She was not indifferent to him, he was fairly certain of that. The way she looked up when he arrived, the way she had started to save particular things to tell him, observations she had made during the day, sentences that began with, "I was thinking earlier," which he understood to mean she had been thinking of him, of saying it to him, as she went about her day. The way the conversation between them had lost its careful quality and become something easier, more immediate, two people who had stopped measuring each word. But she was also careful in a way that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with what her life had done to her. She had been sustaining herself alone for 3 years, and the mechanisms she had developed for that were deeply embedded. Depending on someone required a kind of trust that took time to build, and she was building it deliberately, methodically, the way she did everything. He was patient, or he made himself be patient, which was not the same thing but had the same effect. In September, the court ruled on Drummond's challenge to the authenticity of the 1878 document. The original document was produced and examined by a handwriting expert, and the expert's conclusion was careful but damning. The signature appeared inconsistent with samples of Thomas Turner's handwriting from other verified documents. The court did not rule it definitively fraudulent, but ordered a further investigation, and in the meantime stayed any proceedings under the claimed right of refusal. Edgar Collies left Caldwell 2 days after the ruling and did not come back. The county investigation was eventually closed without definitive findings, which was not a perfect outcome, but it was an effectively permanent one, because without Collies's presence and pressure the claim had no advocate, and within 3 months it had died of its own inertia. Nellie was still standing. The evening after the court ruling, Lionel came by the farm and she was on the porch, and the evening light was the particular gold of early September in Kansas, long and warm, and she looked at him when he came up the path and smiled, a real one, not the brief reluctant ones from earlier but a full and open one, and it hit him somewhere in the region of his ribcage with considerable force. "It is over," she said. "It is over," he agreed. He sat down on the porch steps and she sat in the chair beside the door, and they watched the light go and talked for a long time about everything and nothing, comfortable in the way that people become comfortable when they have been through something together and come out the other side. At some point she said, "What will you do now? You spent most of your savings on this." He had thought about that. Keep working for Dutch for another year or two. Save again. "I was planning to buy land. I can still plan that." "You derailed your own plans to fix my situation," she said, not accusatory, just stating it. "I made a choice," he said. "I would make the same one again." She looked at him with those amber eyes in the fading light. "Lionel," she said slowly, "can I ask you something and have you answer honestly? You can always ask me that. Are you in love with me?" The directness of it made him want to laugh, which he controlled because this was not a laughing moment. He looked back at her steadily. "Yes," he said, significantly. She held his gaze. "I thought so," she said. "I have been thinking about that fact for several weeks." "And," he said, which required more courage than most things he had done in his life. "And," she said, "I am in love with you too. Which is terrifying to me and which I have been resisting very actively for the better part of 2 months." "I noticed the resistance," he said. "You were very patient about it. You needed to come to it yourself." "I did," she said. She looked down at her hands for a moment and then back up at him. "I am not easy to be with, Lionel. I am stubborn and I am proud and I am very bad at asking for help, and I am going to fight you on things I should probably just accept gracefully." "I know," he said, "and you think you want that anyway." "I know I want that," he said, "specifically that, not a different version of you, that one." She was quiet for a moment. The last light went and the first stars came out, and somewhere in the pasture Clover moved softly through the grass. "Come here," she said. He stood from the steps and came to stand before her, and she stood up from the chair, and she was close enough that he could see every detail of her face in the early dark, and he waited, because this was her choice to make and her moment to direct. She put her hand against his jaw carefully, like she was testing something, and then she kissed him. Not tentatively but not overwhelmingly either, something honest and deliberate, like most of what she did. He put his hands at her waist and kissed her back, and the porch was very quiet, and the stars were coming out one by one over the Kansas grassland, and he thought, "Here. This is the place. This is the thing I was moving toward all those years without knowing what it was." He rode back to Dutch's ranch in the dark for what turned out to be one of the last times, because things moved quickly after that. Not recklessly. Nellie was not a reckless person, and he had taken on enough of her carefulness by proximity that he was operating more deliberately than was his natural state. But the facts of the situation were clear. He was in love with her and she was in love with him, and they were adults who had both done enough living to know their own minds, and the practical architecture of a life together was not particularly complicated. He had a steady income. She had the farm. The farm needed more hands than she alone could provide. He needed land and a home and a reason to stop moving. He proposed to her 10 days later. He had thought carefully about how to do it and had decided that the most honest approach was the best one, which was to sit across from her at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and speak plainly. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to come here and work this land with you. I want to be the person who is here when things go wrong and here when things go right. I want to build something permanent with you. Those are my intentions, and they are all of them." She looked at her coffee cup and then at him, and her expression was doing several things at once that he had learned to read: the measuring, the considering, the checking herself against her own depth. "You would give up your position at the Broken H," she said. "I would speak with Dutch. I may be able to continue some work for him part-time while we get established here. He is a reasonable man." "It would be hard," she said. "This farm is not profitable yet. We would be building from very little." "I am aware of that. I am not an easy person to live with," she reminded him. "You mentioned that. I will probably make you crazy on a regular basis." "I am looking forward to it," he said, and the corner of his mouth turned up. She was quiet for a long time, which he had learned to wait through. "Yes," she said. "My answer is yes, but I have a condition." "Name it." "We are partners, equal partners, in everything regarding this farm and this life. I do not become your dependent. I do not stop being the person who makes half the decisions. I have been my own person for too long to stop now." "Nellie," he said, "that is not a condition. That is just a description of how I intend this to work." She looked at him, and the smile came through, the full one, the one that changed everything. They were married in October of 1882 at the small church on the edge of Caldwell. The ceremony was simple because Nellie had said flatly that she had no interest in a production, and he had agreed. And the result was 20 minutes of genuine vows spoken by two people who meant every word, witnessed by Dutch Holloway, Mrs. Amos from the dry goods store, Alastair Drummond, who had ridden out from Wichita for the occasion, and a handful of neighbors who had come to respect the quiet young woman who had refused to be run off her land. She wore the blue dress she had worn the morning of the auction, which he understood was intentional, a claiming of that day, a conversion of its meaning from something done to her to something she was choosing. After the ceremony, standing on the church steps in the October light with her hand in his, she said quietly, "I wore this dress that morning because I had decided I was going to face it standing in my best. I was going to make it mean something even if the worst happened. And now," he said. "Now it means something entirely different," she said, and looked up at him, and he thought he would remember that look for the rest of his life. He was right. He did. The first winter of their marriage was hard in the way that first winters on grassland farms in Kansas were hard in 1882. The cold came in early and severe, and they lost 2 of the chickens to the cold before they managed to properly winterize the coop. And Lionel spent 3 days in December clearing a section of fence that had been buried in a drift, working in temperatures that turned his breath to fog and made his hands ache deep in the bone. But there was also the fireside in the evenings and Nellie's cooking, which was straightforward but good, and the way she laughed when he told her about the ridiculous things that happened in the course of farm work, the particular comedy of animals doing the opposite of what you wanted, and the books she read to him aloud some evenings because he had told her the truth, that he was not much of a reader, and she had decided to fix that by reading to him. Starting with Ben-Hur and moving through the small collection she had accumulated over the years. He lay on his back on the floor near the fire with his head propped on one hand and listened to her read, and thought that this was the life. This specific combination of things, the cold outside and the warmth inside, and her voice and the lamplight, and the way she sometimes stopped to make an observation about a passage before continuing. He told Dutch in February that he could not continue even the part-time foreman work through the spring planting season, because his own farm needed him full-time. Dutch had nodded with the expression of a man who had foreseen this and was not particularly surprised by it. "You are a good foreman," Dutch said. "If you ever need the work again, the door is open." "I appreciate that," Lionel said, "but I do not intend to need it." He meant that. He had plans for the farm that went beyond simply keeping it going. The 80 acres had good soil in the eastern section that had never been fully cultivated. If they put in a proper crop rotation and expanded the kitchen garden and added a few more head of cattle, the farm could be more than self-sustaining. It could be genuinely productive. He and Nellie spent the winter evenings planning it. She had a practical intelligence about the land that surprised him initially and then stopped surprising him. because he understood that she had been studying it for years, reading every piece of information about dryland farming techniques that she could get her hands on. She had ideas about water management that were ahead of most of what he had seen in the area. Together, their knowledge was considerably more complete than either of them alone. By spring, they had a plan and they worked it side by side. And the work was hard in a way that felt completely different from every other kind of hard work he had done, because it was theirs. He watched her in the field some mornings, moving with the focused efficiency that was completely characteristic of her, and he felt a love for her that was so specific and so detailed that it sometimes made him stop what he was doing for a moment, just a moment, to hold the fact of it. Spring gave way to summer, and the summer of 1883 was a good one. The rains came when they should. The winter wheat came in well. The vegetable garden produced more than they needed, and Nellie began selling the excess at the Caldwell market on Saturday mornings, loading the wagon with careful stacks of preserved goods and fresh produce. And he drove her in and helped set up, and then stepped back, because she handled the selling with a directness and good humor that brought people back every week. She was building a reputation, he noticed, not just as a farmer but as herself. People in Caldwell who had watched her stand on that auction block 16 months earlier were watching her now with a different expression, one that had the particular quality of witnessing someone succeed in a way that the observer had privately doubted was possible. He found that deeply satisfying on her behalf. In the fall of 1883, Nellie told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen in her direct way, sitting down across the table from him with a cup of tea and saying simply, "I am going to have a baby. I have been fairly certain for about 3 weeks and now I am very certain." He sat with this for a moment. He had wanted it, the idea of it, though he had not let himself place too much weight on any particular outcome. Life had taught him to hold desires lightly, but now that it was real and present, sitting in the kitchen with his wife looking at him with those steady amber eyes, he felt something unfold in his chest that was enormous and warm and slightly overwhelming. "Are you all right?" he said, which was the first thing he could form into a sentence. "I am quite well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but otherwise fine." He stood up and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair so they were eye level, and he took both her hands in his. "Nellie." "Do not cry," she said, her voice immediately unsteady, "because if you cry I will cry, and I have been very resolute about not crying today." "I am not crying," he said, which was nearly true. "You are very close to crying." "I am feeling a great many things, and one of them is approximately adjacent to crying," he allowed. And she laughed, the full one, and then her eyes went bright and she leaned forward and put her forehead against his, and they held that, forehead to forehead, in the kitchen of the house she had fought to keep, in the life they had built from the ruins of a debt and a public auction and a man who could not look away from an injustice, and the whole improbable length of it was present in that moment. Their son was born in June of 1884, at the height of the warmest summer on record in Comanche County. He came into the world with excellent lungs and a quantity of dark hair, and Lionel held him for the first time with the particular careful terror of a man who was not afraid of much but who was very afraid of dropping something irreplaceable. Nellie, exhausted and bright-eyed in the bed, watched him and said, "You look terrified." "I am completely terrified," he confirmed. "He is quite sturdy," she said. "You will not break him." The baby made a sound that was somewhere between a squawk and a demand. "He sounds like you," Lionel said. "He does not," she said, clearly pleased. "He absolutely does. That is the exact sound you make when someone suggests a plan you have already decided against." She laughed and winced simultaneously. "Do not make me laugh yet. I have just had a baby." They named him Thomas for her father, with the middle name of William for no one in particular, except that it fit well with Thomas and with Graves. Thomas William Graves, who from the first weeks of his life looked at the world with an expression of intense evaluation that was so familiar to Lionel from his mother's face that he caught himself laughing at it regularly. The years that followed were full. They expanded the farm as they had planned. By 1885, they had doubled their crop rotation and added a small herd of 6 cattle. By 1886, they had hired a hand, a young man from a neighboring farm named Albert, who was 17 and worked hard and was grateful for the steady income. By 1887, the Turner farm, which Nellie had insisted on keeping the name, on the grounds that it was her father's legacy, and she saw no reason to erase it just because she had a different last name now, was one of the more productive small operations in the county. People came to them for advice about dryland farming. Nellie gave it freely and precisely, and Lionel watched with considerable pride as she became known not just as the woman who had refused to be auctioned off, but as someone whose agricultural knowledge was worth seeking. They had arguments, because she had been accurate in her prediction that she would fight him on things, and he had also been accurate in his prediction that he would find it stimulating rather than intolerable. The arguments were loud sometimes, but they were fair. Neither of them fought dirty. Neither of them held grudges. They had both had enough of difficult things that small grievances did not find purchase. And then there were the other moments, the quiet ones. The ones that did not make for dramatic stories, but that were, he knew, the actual substance of a good life. The evening in the spring of 1885, when a late frost had threatened the crop, and they had been out past midnight covering the seedlings with every scrap of cloth they owned, working in the dark by lantern light, and somewhere in the exhaustion and the cold and the shared purpose she had grabbed his hand, and held it for just a moment as they moved between the rows, and it had been nothing and everything. The Sunday mornings when she read aloud from whatever book she had recently acquired, and Thomas, as he grew old enough to understand, would crawl into her lap and listen with his father's quality of serious attention. The way Lionel had learned to hear the particular footstep that meant she was coming to find him when she wanted to say something, as opposed to the footstep that meant she was moving through the house with a purpose, and he was not the purpose. He loved that he could distinguish them. He loved that he knew her that well. In the autumn of 1887, Nellie told him she was expecting again. This time she told him at the kitchen table over supper, when Thomas, who was 3.5, was sitting in his chair eating with the focused determination that characterized all his meals. And she said, "There is going to be another one." And Lionel looked up from his plate and met her eyes, and they held a private conversation across the table in the space of a look that required no words because they had developed that capacity, the shorthand of people who had been reading each other for 5 years. The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1888, and they named her Margaret after no one in particular because Nellie said she wanted this one to have a name that was entirely her own, not carrying anyone else's weight. Margaret Lionel Graves, who came into the world very quietly, unlike her brother, and looked at everything with large, serious, watchful eyes that she had from her mother. Thomas, who was now almost 4, regarded his sister with an expression of complicated assessment for the first day or two, and then settled into a protective watchfulness over her that became one of the constants of their household, this serious small boy who had appointed himself a guardian. Life built itself in layers. Albert, their farmhand, had by 1888 become nearly part of the household, taking his meals with them regularly, and proving himself not just a capable worker but a thoughtful and decent young man whose parents had died when he was 14, and who had a need for belonging that the Graves farm was very quietly meeting. Nellie treated him with the matter-of-fact warmth she extended to anyone who worked hard and behaved honestly, and Lionel had conversations with him in the evenings that had the quality of a mentorship, sharing what he had learned about land management and cattle, and the practical business of making a farm work. There was an evening in the fall of 1888 when Lionel was sitting on the porch after supper, watching the light go off the grassland, and Nellie came out and sat beside him, and Thomas was already in bed and Margaret was asleep in her cradle inside, and the farm was quiet around them. And she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that in the long autumn light. "I was thinking about the morning of the auction today," she said. "What about it?" "I was thinking about what I was expecting to happen. I had worked out in my mind what the worst version of it would be, and I had decided I would survive it. I was very focused on surviving." "And you were going to," he said. "Yes, I was," she agreed. "But I was not expecting anything like this." She was quiet for a moment. "I did not know this was available, this specific thing. I had stopped imagining it." He tightened his arm around her. "I had too," he said. "I had made a kind of peace with the idea that certain things were not for me. And then there I was," she said, and he could hear the quiet humor in it, "standing on a public auction block." "And then there you were," he agreed. She lifted her head and looked at him, and the amber in her eyes in the late light was the same color as the autumn grass and the same color as the sky just above the horizon. And he thought for probably the 10,000th time that she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, not in the way that required distance or idealization, but in the close, specific, detailed way that only came from truly knowing someone. He kissed her temple. She made a small sound and settled back against his shoulder. "We need to look at the east pasture fence before the first hard freeze," she said. "I know. Albert noticed a weak section near the property line. I will look at it tomorrow. I was also thinking about adding to the herd in the spring." "How many?" "3 or 4. The grazing land can support it now that we have managed the eastern section properly." "Agreed." She was quiet for a moment. "And Thomas needs new boots. He has grown out of his again. I will take him into town on Saturday. Take him to Mrs. Amos. She has a good eye for children's sizing." "All right." Another quiet. The grassland held its breath in the last of the light. "Lionel," she said. "Yes." "I am very happy." He pressed his lips to her hair. "I know," he said. "I am too." He meant it with the whole of himself. The years continued to add up in the way that good years do, with a richness that only becomes visible in retrospect. The winter of 1889 was hard, but they had prepared well, and the spring that followed was extraordinary, one of those seasons that seemed designed to compensate for what came before, and their wheat crop in the summer of 1889 was the best they had yet produced. Thomas started school that fall, riding into Caldwell on a small horse named Biscuit that Lionel had selected with great care for temperament and gentleness. And he came back every day with the expression of someone who had been given access to an enormous amount of interesting information and was sorting through it industriously. He had his mother's hunger for understanding, that same intense engagement with how things worked. Margaret, at 18 months, had developed opinions about everything and was expressing them at considerable volume despite having only a limited vocabulary, which Nellie said was an early indication of good character and Lionel said was an early indication of a personality very similar to her mother's, which earned him a look that he had learned to receive with a straight face. By 1890, the Turner farm was one of the larger small operations in the county, with 20 acres under regular cultivation, a herd of 12 cattle, a proper chicken operation that produced enough eggs for their own use and a surplus that Nellie sold in town, and a kitchen garden that provided most of their vegetable needs through the growing season and much of the preserved food through winter. Dutch Holloway came by for supper one evening in the spring of 1890, making the drive out from the Broken H for the occasion, and he sat at their table and ate and watched the household operate and then leaned back with his coffee and looked at Lionel with the expression of a man who was satisfied to have been witness to something. "When you came to work for me in 81, Dutch said, you were a good man and a good worker, and one of the most settled-looking, unsettled people I have ever met." "I was," Lionel agreed. "You are different now." "In what way?" Dutch looked around the kitchen at the evidence of a full life, the children's things in the corner, the neatly organized shelves, the pair of small boots by the door, Nellie at the stove adding coffee to the pot. "Every possible way," Dutch said simply. Lionel followed his look and felt the familiar expansion in his chest that was not quite pride and not quite gratitude but was something that contained both of those things and more beside. "Yes," he said. "I suppose I am." Nellie came back to the table with the coffee and set it down and sat, and caught something in the quality of their silence. "What are you two talking about?" she asked, looking from Dutch to Lionel. "Dutch was remarking on my improvement over the last several years," Lionel said. She looked at Dutch. "He has improved enormously," she said, with great gravity, and Dutch laughed and Lionel shook his head, and the evening went on in the warmth of the kitchen. In the summer of 1890, Alastair Drummond came from Wichita with news. He came in person because the news was the kind that deserved a face and not just a letter. He arrived at the farm on a Wednesday afternoon, and Nellie brought him coffee on the porch, and Lionel came in from the field. And Drummond set down his cup with an expression that was controlled but satisfied. "The Edgar Collins matter," he said, "has found a final resolution." They had not thought about Edgar Collins in years. The claim had dissolved so completely after the court stay that there had been nothing further to address. The county investigation that was opened regarding the 1878 document authenticity, Drummond continued, was never formally closed, only dormant. It has now been officially reopened following a separate matter in Wichita involving Edgar Collins, who was found to have presented fabricated documents in a land dispute in Harvey County. The Harvey County case was proved conclusively, and in light of that finding, the investigators revisited the Turner document. Nellie's hands were very still around her coffee cup. "The document was fraudulent," Drummond said. "Thomas Turner never signed it. The handwriting was forged. There was never any right of refusal agreement. The whole claim was manufactured." The silence on the porch had a kind of settling quality, like something that had been held suspended for years finally coming to rest. "Edgar Collins is in jail," Drummond said. "He will be tried in Harvey County next month on the fraud charges. The county has issued a formal finding that the claimed right of refusal on the Turner property was fraudulent and has entered the record accordingly." Nellie let out a long, slow breath. "My father never signed it," she said. "Never," Drummond confirmed. She looked at the grassland beyond the fence, and Lionel could see her doing something with her expression, putting something to rest, something about her father, about the idea that he had made a careless agreement that had endangered everything he had built. "Thank you, Alastair," she said quietly. "That matters a great deal." Drummond nodded. He understood, because he was a perceptive man, that the legal closure was secondary to the other thing. The knowledge that her father had not made that mistake, that the threat had been entirely external. After Drummond left, Nellie stood on the porch for a while looking out, and Lionel stood beside her and let her have the silence. "He was a careful man," she said at last. "My father, he was careful about agreements and about his word. I had spent years thinking he had been careless just that once at the worst possible moment." "He was not careless," Lionel said. "No," she said, "he was not." She took a breath. "All right." She looked at him with eyes that were bright but clear. "All right." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him. And after a moment he felt her straighten, the familiar movement of a woman returning to herself. "The fence in the east pasture needs another look," she said. "I know," he said, and squeezed her shoulders. And she made a small sound that was somehow both laughing and not laughing, and they went in to start supper. By 1892, Thomas was 8 and Margaret was 4 and Nellie was 34 and Lionel was 41, and the farm had grown into something that neither of them could have fully imagined 10 years earlier. They had taken on a second hired hand, a man named Samuel who had a family of his own, and lived in a small house at the property edge that Lionel had helped him build. The herd had grown to 20 head. The crop rotation was producing enough that they were selling at a profit most years. Not a large profit, but a consistent one, which was more meaningful than a large profit. One evening in November, after the children were in bed and Samuel and Albert had gone to their homes, Lionel and Nellie sat by the fire in the sitting room, which they had furnished slowly over the years, piece by piece as they could afford to, until it was a room that felt genuinely like themselves. with 2 armchairs and a good lamp and shelves of books and a worn rug, and the children's drawings tacked to the wall in an arrangement that Nellie had made when Thomas was 4 and never quite managed to reorganize because she loved them where they were. She was reading. He was doing the farm accounts. The fire was the steady kind that needed no attention. He looked up from the accounts and watched her for a moment, her face in the lamplight, the dark hair that had a little silver in it now, at her temples, which he found beautiful in a way he had not anticipated finding anything beautiful. The amber eyes moving across the page. The small unconscious expression she made when the book did something she approved or did not approve of. He thought about the morning she had stood on that auction block. About the particular quality of her stillness on the platform, the armor, the chin level, the refusal to perform distress for the crowd. About what it had cost her to hold herself that way. He thought about what it had cost him to walk through that crowd. Not in terms of money, though the money had been considerable. In terms of something less tangible. He had spent his entire adult life maintaining a very specific kind of self-sufficiency, staying clear of entanglements, keeping his heart in a manageable location. Walking toward that auction block had been walking toward the end of all of that, and he had known it even before he knew her. He had done it anyway. She looked up from her book and caught him watching her, the small smile, the particular one. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking. You are going to make the accounts take twice as long." "Probably," he agreed and returned to the numbers, but the smile stayed with him. He finished the accounts and she finished her chapter, and the fire burned down and they sat in the quiet that was the particular quality of quiet that only existed between people who were deeply comfortable with each other, who had no need to fill space, who carried their ease like something built rather than given. "I was thinking," she said eventually, "about having another." He set down his pen. "Were you?" "I am 34. It becomes more difficult as time passes. If we are going to, it should be soon." She looked at him with the direct eyes. "I want to know what you think, actually." "I think," he said, "that 2 is a full household and 3 would be a full life." She looked at him. "Yes, yes." She nodded the way she nodded when a decision was made and she was moving on to the practical dimensions of it. "Then we should probably discuss timing relative to the spring planting." He stared at her. Then he laughed genuinely, fully, the way he only ever laughed in this house, in this room, with this woman. "Only you," he said. "What?" She was genuinely puzzled for a moment, and then she caught the humor in it and laughed too. "It is a reasonable practical consideration," she protested. "It is the most reasonable practical consideration anyone has ever applied to this particular subject," he said. Their 3rd child arrived in September of 1893, another boy, whom they named James after no particular James, but because Nellie said it was a solid name that would not cause a child trouble. And James Turner Graves came into the world as the sun went over the horizon on a warm September evening, and the Kansas grassland outside the window was gold and amber, and exactly the color of his mother's eyes. Thomas, who was 9, received the news of a second brother with a resigned acceptance that made Albert and Samuel both laugh when they heard about it. Margaret, who was 5 and had very decided ideas about nearly everything, inspected her new brother with the expression of someone conducting a formal assessment, and then declared him acceptable, which everyone in the household agreed was about as warm a reception as James could have hoped for from his sister. He was a cheerful baby, James. Round-faced and equable, interested in everything, startled by nothing. He slept well, which was a mercy, and he smiled early, which was a gift. He would grow up, as the years unfolded, to have his father's build and his mother's directness, and a quality of easy warmth that was entirely his own, something neither parent had thought to pass on because neither of them had quite had it to give, though they had made between them a household warm enough to grow it in. The farm in Comanche County, Kansas, continued. The seasons came and went with the particular rhythm of agricultural life, demanding and generous in turns, always requiring something and always, in good years, giving something back. The children grew. Thomas became a serious young man with a passion for mathematics and a talent for mechanical problem-solving that had Lionel thinking about whether to put money aside for education. Margaret became exactly the person she had been announcing herself to be since she was born, fierce and principled and very funny, the kind of young woman who was going to make decisions and live with them and not apologize for either. James grew into his father's size and his mother's resolve, and became the kind of person who held a household together without appearing to, the quiet architect of other people's good days. Albert stayed. He became, over the years, so fundamental to the operation that the idea of the farm without him had become inconceivable. He married a young woman from a neighboring farm in 1895, a woman named Clara who had Nellie's practical intelligence and none of her reserve, and who brought a warmth to the property gatherings that everyone appreciated. Albert and Clara had 2 children of their own and built a proper house at the property edge, and were, by any reasonable measure, family. Dutch Holloway died in 1896, of a heart that had been working too hard for too many years, and Lionel rode to the funeral and stood at the graveside in the early winter and thought about the conversation on the Broken H porch the night after he had first had supper with Nellie, Dutch asking with his careful indirection what Lionel was thinking, and Lionel saying he had had supper with the Turner girl. He thought about what Dutch had said. Well, I suppose that is a start. It had been a start. What a start it had been. He told Nellie about it on the ride home, the memory, and she listened and was quiet for a while. He was a kind man, she said. In his way, Lionel agreed. He helped you see that something was worth doing. He asked the right question at the right moment, Lionel said. That is its own kind of help. She reached across from her horse and put her hand briefly over his on the reins, and he turned his hand over and held hers for a moment in the cold November air, and they rode home together in the early dark. The house had lights in the windows when they came up the road, and the smell of supper was coming through the walls, and Thomas was in the doorway before they had tied the horses, 17 years old and still carrying that quality of serious watchfulness, asking if they were all right, because he was the kind of young man who asked that. They were all right. They were very much all right. On the evening of their 15th anniversary, in October of 1897, Nellie and Lionel sat on the porch after supper the way they had sat on many hundreds of evenings, in the chairs that had replaced the original porch chair twice over by now, looking out over the farm that was fully and completely theirs, that had been fought for and built and added to, and was now a real thing in the world, a working place. A home that held 3 children and 2 hired families, and a history that had started on an auction block and became this. The grassland in October was going gold and copper in the last light. The cattle were in the near pasture, and Clover, who was very old now and very gentle, stood near the fence in her favored spot. The light was doing the particular western Kansas thing it did in fall, going amber and long, the way it had on a dozen evenings they had marked without meaning to. 15 years, Nellie said. 15 years, he agreed. We have done a considerable amount in 15 years, she said. We have done more than I thought possible, he said, and meant it. She looked at him. Are you happy, Lionel, genuinely? It was the kind of question she still asked sometimes directly, because she had not lost the habit of checking the reality of things, of wanting the honest answer and not the comfortable one. Nellie, he said, I am the happiest I have ever been. I have been the happiest I have ever been for approximately 14 years. It has been increasing in that direction since roughly October of 1882, and I do not see any indication that the trend will reverse. She looked at him for a long moment, and then the full smile came, the one that had not changed in 15 years, the one he had first seen on the porch of this house on an evening in early summer when she had been trying not to let him see how tired she was. I have been thinking, she said, about what I want on my gravestone. You are 39 years old, he said. I know, but it is good to know your own mind. What I wanted to say is, she was still standing. He looked at her and felt the whole of everything in his chest, all 15 years of it, The auction block and the debt and the fraudulent document and the hard winters and the good summers and the children and the arguments and the quiet evenings and the sound of her reading aloud and the feel of her hand in his on a cold November road, and all of it folded into this moment. "That is an excellent thing to want on your gravestone," he said. "And on yours?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "He found what he was moving toward," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said softly, "you did." She reached out and he took her hand, and they held on in the last of the autumn light, the grassland gold around them and the house warm behind them and the whole broad future still ahead, and it was enough. It was so much more than enough. It was everything, and it was real, and it was theirs. The farm held them as it held its acres, firmly and without apology, through the seasons that would come and the seasons that would pass. And Nellie Turner Graves and Lionel Graves remained what they had become to each other in the aftermath of one fierce afternoon on a rough-hewn auction block in Caldwell, Kansas. The one thing neither of them had known to look for, and the best thing either of them had ever found.